This is on the Parsha Korach. Today we'll be taking a look at a piece from Shem Shmuel. I encourage you to pause the video and to possibly look up the piece on the inside, and also to read the verses in their entirety on the screen. But I'll do a summary outside for those of us who are need a little bit of a refresher on Parsha Korach. So Parsha Korach, Korach, and he foments a rebellion against Moshe, claiming that Moshe Rabbeinu made appointments, like maybe perhaps of Aaron HaKohen or of Elsaphan ben Uziel, without consulting God, that he was just doing nepotism, and that Korach really was the person who should have had one of those positions, but maybe Moshe just felt like, oh, I'm going to honor my brother, or I'm going to honor this cousin because I like him. And he just did it without consulting God. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, okay, you think that's true? So you bring fire pan offerings with you and your followers, and if Hashem turns to your guys' offerings, that will be a proof that I'm a fraud and you are correct. And vice versa, if he doesn't turn to your offering. So then we all know what happens, that Korach gets swallowed by the ground, which seems to be a very big proof to that obviously Korach was not the guy, and that Moshe Rabbeinu was the correct leader of Klal Yisrael, and all of his appointments were evidence. Now, where these verses pick up on the screen is that now Hashem is telling the Kohanim to go pick up the fire pans, take the fire out of the fire pans, and then beat the copper fire pans down so that they can be a covering from the altar. Because up to this point, the altar didn't have a covering, and so when they were offering, it was on the ground. But now they would be offering on copper covering. So the Shem Shmuel has a bunch of questions on all of this. And his first question that he wants us to deal with is that the fire pans were used to try to prove that Moshe Rabbeinu was not correct and that he was doing nepotism. Yet we use those fire pans as a covering for the altar. Why would we make something that's from an Aveira and use that thing, that material, for a mitzvah? Why don't you just take something that was never used before, that's untainted, and use that to build the covering of the altar? Why does it have to be that we're using the fire pans of sinners for the altar? Which is really supposed to bring atonement for Klal Yisrael, right? So it's kind of counterintuitive. Now, another question that he has is that we have such an emphasis on copper. These fire pans are made out of copper, and that's where they brought these incense offerings on. So his question is that we don't find copper being connected to incense anywhere else in the Torah. In fact, all the other connections to any metal when it comes to incense is to gold. So what's going on over here? And then another seemingly unrelated question, but we'll tie it all together later, is that the first verse mentions Korach's yichus, his family. And it says Korach, then Yitzchar, then Kohath, then Levi, and it stops, and it doesn't go any further than Levi. And the rabbis tell us the reason for that is that Yaakov Avinu, on his deathbed, davened that his name not be associated with this machlokas, with the machlokas of Korach. The Shem Shmuel says, well, I don't really understand that. Of what consequence is it that Yaakov Avinu's name would be mentioned in regards to Korach? And why would his name even come up anyways? Like, he's been gone a long time. So the first thing the Shem Shmuel does is he gives us a few little introductions. He says, first you have to understand the nature of metals. So he quotes, I believe, the Zohar that says that gold represents Yira, Kasef represents Abba, and Barzel, which is like copper, Nechashis, represents, I shouldn't have said Barzel. Nechashis represents like strength and resolve, like a strength of character. Az Kenemer, being strong to do the mitzvahs of Hashem. And he then goes on to say that also the metals correspond to the others, right? Avram corresponds, he says, to gold, and Yitzchak corresponds to silver, and Nechashis corresponds to Yaakov. And we know that Yaakov is the choicest of the choicest when it comes to our avos. So we've built it up a little bit. Now let's start to take it home. So the Shem Shmuel says that we said that copper, which represents like strength of character, and it represents Yaakov, which is supposedly, according to what we're saying, the choicest of all the avos and choicest of all the metals. Its properties can sometimes go in the wrong direction. Anything can be channeled for good. You have a good midah, right? It could be like love. Sometimes too much love is not a good thing. So love is good, but sometimes too much is, not good. So the same thing when it comes to copper, which is represented about being bold and resolute in the service of Hashem. Sometimes a person can get to a point that they're completely unyielding to the point that they come off as chutzpahdik. That the Tanakh describes it as somebody is having a copper forehead, somebody being stubborn. So we see it can go in both directions. So what the Shema Shmuel says is that actually Hashem likes when people serve him with a little bit of copper, with a little bit of brass. But he doesn't want you to go overboard with it. And that's represented by the fire pans. The fire pans themselves, which were made of copper, Hashem likes that. He did like it. But you know what he didn't like? When they went overboard. So like, remember we said the fire pans had a fire that was emanating from them? And what does Hashem immediately order them to do? He says, take that fire off of it. Okay? Take the overboard, so to speak, off of it. And I want you to keep the root, the azkanemer, the strength, and use that and beat that into the mizbeach, because I want people to serve me like this. Okay? And that was really the root of Korach's sin. Korach's sin was he was overly bold. And he got too cocky. Now, we can understand now why Yaakov Avinu did not want his name associated with this machlokus. Because people, if they saw Yaakov Avinu's name next to Korach, they would just be like, oh, Yaakov Avinu is being like Korach. You see, Korach is like Yaakov is like his great-great-grandfather or something like that. And his great-great-grandfather was somebody who was unyielding and stood up for like justice and was azkanemer in the service of the Torah. So Korach is just being like him, just like his great-grandfather. So Yaakov Avinu said, I don't want my name associated with him so that people won't excuse Korach's behavior. I do not want people to excuse Korach's behavior to just saying that he's acting like me, because he's not. He's doing it because he's gone overboard, and he's doing it in a gaivadik way, so to speak. So now we see here this beautiful idea that sometimes, like when things that are bad are done, sometimes there is some sort of a good root that can be salvaged from within the rubble. So may we all merit to use all the midos that we have in a good way, and in a measured way, and in a refined way.